Hello, Humanities 1302, and welcome back to another lecture here in class. And today the topic that we're going to be going over is going to be that of art and literature during the medieval period. Now, I'm going to divide this lecture up really into two sections. First, we're going to take a look at the art, specifically artwork that was being produced during this period, and then we'll talk about literature that was being produced in medieval England. Now, as we talk about the arts, I'm going to focus more broadly on medieval Europe at large as opposed to just refining and looking at just medieval artwork within England. Now, at the center of the art world during the medieval period will be religion. Now, we've already seen religion plays a major role in medieval society through social structures, through the exchange of land, and so forth. But it also plays a very important role in art. And a big reason for this is because we need to understand really the lay people, the peasantry, in order to understand why much of the imagery they would be exposed to will be influenced by religion. As we had talked about when we had gone over religion in medieval Europe, or I should say medieval England, we talked about how the Bible was only read in Latin during much of this earlier portion of this period, and it was really frowned upon, and I should say illegal for you to read it in English or in some other language outside of Latin. And why that's important is because much of the lay population, the peasantry, isn't going to actually be able to understand what's being preached within Mass. And so the question is, how are they going to be able to learn the different stories of the Bible if they can't understand the very language it's being spoken in? Well, that's where artwork comes into play. There's going to be a number of pieces of artwork that will be produced in churches all across medieval Europe, depicting scenes from the Bible, whether it be the Old or the New Testament, to try to depict that story that they wouldn't be able to understand that was being spoken in Latin. Now, there are going to be a couple of images that I'm going to throw up here on the screen that are going to be really relevant for us in the later portion of the medieval period. And the first of these images comes from a collection of images called The Life of Jesus. And I'm going to butcher this name, so I apologize, but by Juan Giotto de Bondone. Now, these images depict various scenes from the New Testament within the four Gospels, out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it depicts Jesus' life and his ministry as it unfolds. And images like this one are also going to be seen throughout much of Europe. Now, I do want to take note with the images that you're seeing with the life of Jesus is one thing that you'll notice is they're not going to have the same really focus on geometric proportion on what you would see within the Renaissance. However, if you were to compare these images to previous images being produced during this period, it starts to look like there's more of an emphasis being put on geometric proportion, trying to make these images as lifelike as possible. And you start to see that develop later on within the medieval period, and this is really kind of proto-Renaissance paintings, if you will. They're starting to uncover some of the old techniques. Now, another set of pieces of artwork that I also wanted to put up here on the screen are going to come from another artist by the name of Ambrogio Lorenzetti. Now, this set of pieces of artwork that I'm displaying here on the screen, they're going to concern politics in government in general. And it's called The Allegory of Bad Government. It's part of a series that was produced for the Council of Nine, which also includes the Allegory of Good Government. And basically what these images are trying to portray to that Council of Nine is they're trying to demonstrate for that council, if they were to govern in a good fashion, it would lead to a prosperous society. Whereas if they were to govern in a bad fashion, as you can see through the image, well, this would lead the society to descend into anarchy. And why this image is important is because we start to see that there's more of a consciousness during this period towards the ideas of government, people's role in the government, and the idea of misrule. And as we get into periods in the future, we'll start to see that this issue of promoting government, not necessarily having government promoted by kings, is also going to become more prominent. Now, there are a number of other pieces of artwork that we could discuss that come from this period, but these are just a couple of examples that really show us how both religion as well as politics play a major role in artwork at the time. Now, also what you could categorize under artwork is if you look at the architecture of the period, this comes during the Gothic age, if you will, still a pre-Renaissance period to where their geometric proportions aren't going to be quite as what you'll see in the Renaissance. But anyways, that's a topic entirely separate. But now that we've taken a look at the arts, now that we've taken a look at some of these images, let's now flip the script over to literature. Because literature, especially that's being produced within medieval England, is really going to reflect a lot of the social events that we see occurring at this particular moment in time, especially as individuals are beginning to lose faith within the church. So to open up our discussion about literature, I want to talk about the trends that we're beginning to develop, first around the English language, as well as around English documents by the time we get to the 1350s, 1400s year range. Now, really quickly, I think I had mentioned it in a previous lecture. Increasingly, as we see social unrest develop during this period as a result of the Peasants' Revolt, as well as everything that's happened in the events of the 100 Years' War, as well as the Black Death, what the peasantry was beginning to realize is that documents were power. And so increasingly, especially amongst a group that we may categorize, and I just want to loosely categorize them as such, as the middle class, we start to see literacy rates go up as a result. And a big reason for this is because they saw the importance of documents in securing their rights. And I do want to point out that literacy rates are really going to be high amongst the, I guess what we characterize today, not only the nobility, but also the upper middle class. And if you look at the average peasant, even when you get to the establishment of Gutenberg's press in the 1400s, literacy rates aren't going to be relatively high. But you do start to see a trend to where more individuals are becoming literate, starting to write these documents because they saw their importance, at least in securing their rights. Now, also what I wanted to talk about in regards to literature at this period, before we start talking about actual works that are being produced that reflect society, I also want to talk about the English language specifically. Now, as all these trends are developing, English itself was becoming a more mainstream, if you will, language. The reason for this is because English, Old English, usually the language of the peasantry, it had been spoken for quite some time, but it wasn't seen as really a language of the upper class. If you were to go over to England, following the Norman conquest of England in 1066, if you were to look at the nobility, if you were to look at Parliament, they did all business in French or in Latin. To them, basically, English was a language of the peasantry. It was beneath them. They shouldn't speak it. But by the time you get to the 12th, and especially by the 13th and 14th centuries, this begins to change. You start to see that the nobility becomes more prominently bilingual in both French as well as English, and you start to see that some business was beginning to be conducted in English. Now, in regards to literature, most of the literature prior to the period we're really discussing will be read in either Latin or in French. But this begins to change by the mid-1300s when we say, and I'm going to butcher this name as well, when one Geoffrey Chaucer begins to produce a number of works, some of which that you might have been familiar with, like the Canterbury Tales, as well as one that we'll be reading this week, that of Piers Plowman. Now, these works, what they're essentially going to be is largely written first in English, which is the first time we start to see an author really produce these work in English. And it's no surprise Chaucer will be considered the first true English author. But what they essentially are reflecting, one, things that were beginning to develop in their own times, especially social trends, and they were social satires. Really, essentially, they're going to be mocking a lot of the clergy as well as the religious ruling class because of everything that we talked about, what had developed during the mid-1300s in regards to religion. It was really reflecting the public sentiment that there was a distrust towards the clergy, especially after the episodes of the Black Death, to where those who would come out and deliver the final rites would die, and other clergy would refuse to do this in the process. And so it was really challenging the church, if you will, following some of those religious trends that we see develop. And furthermore, as a part of the satire that was being produced at the time, they mock the church, basically saying that they're calling for individuals to turn away from sin when they themselves weren't exactly doing that. And through these works, what you will see is that basically it's individuals going out on a pilgrimage and showing this kind of underbelly of what I just discussed with the social satire. Alongside Chaucer, another piece of literature, or a form of literature that we do see during this period that will be widely popular, is going to be that of a myth really surrounding the fabled King Arthur, or what's better known as Arthurianism. Now, through this Arthurian myth that was being promoted, really its origins date back, if you will, to the Norman invasion, to where there was this fabled English king that had not only united the British Isles, but it had also united portions of Europe as well. It actually has its origins within the French language, and it was probably brought over as a result of the Norman invasion. But nonetheless, this myth was widely popular because it talked about a pious king who had defeated the Romans and established this massive English empire, as I just mentioned a moment ago. However, what was also characteristic within this story is that following his death, that empire was in shambles. It was torn apart because of civil war. And it proved to be a very vital myth, especially for members of the nobility, because it demonstrated the importance, at least, of unifying their lands to avoid this dangerous civil war. Now, as a part of the Arthurian myth, I do want to point out that certain groups are going to argue that King Arthur wasn't actually dead, and that he was actually still alive. If you look at the Welsh people, they believe that he had Welsh origins, and one day he would come back to liberate them, and other groups similarly would take on other tacks of this myth in a very similar fashion. Now, for those living in medieval Europe, really the Arthurian myth turns into history. You see a number of works that would be produced, the most famous of which would be that of Roman de Brute by one Wace, who would write this in the early, I believe, 11th century, if I remember correctly, basically characterizing King Arthur as an actual historic king. Now, if we look at the historic record, the question is King Arthur actually a king? Did he actually exist? The answer is no. It's simply a myth. But nonetheless, embedded in this Arthurianism myth will be that history that will influence the upper class to try to achieve those goals of expanding the English Empire, as well as, in some cases, trying to avoid civil war. It would also promote the code of chivalry by promoting the famed Knights of the Round Table, and you could dive deeper into this in your own time, but I'm just going to quickly go over it really fast. But anyways, the importance of this myth was for the upper class and solidifying their authority. And during the 100 Years' War, we'd see that King Edward would actually call on this Arthurian myth to try to gain public support for the 100 Years' War. However, as we start to see a bunch of social unrest begin to occur, we start to see that a lot of people aren't really appealing to this Arthurian myth. And as a result, you would eventually see Edward and later Richard II throw it out and scrap it entirely. But nonetheless, during this period, it would prove vital in promoting, I don't want to say British or English nationalism, but at least establishing some sort of English goal within the 100 Years' War. And periodically, you will see some kings revert back to this Arthurian myth, something that was very well known amongst the English people. Now, with that said, that's really all that I wanted to cover in regards to literature. There are a few other notes that I do want to mention before we go ahead and end this lecture over the arts and literature. I do want to point out the importance of the church and literature as well. Obviously, we see a lot of the literature during this period is beginning to critique the church. But I wanted to point out how a lot of the literature was also being produced by the church. By this point, you still see the vast number of books that were being produced by monasteries, by the church itself. But you do start to see a trend begin to develop during this period to where that process begins to be put into private hands. You start to see publishers and so forth. And with Gutenberg's press that will come out in 1454, you will see that this trend will only continue and the church will begin to lose grip over producing this literature. But anyways, this pretty much wraps up a quick overview of the arts and literature during this period. What Englishmen at the time, those who would be fighting the 100 Years' War, ultimately are going to encounter. Now, for Chaucer himself, he won't actually be well known amongst his constituents. It won't be until present days, but it does demonstrate to us the importance of literature, or at least producing literature amongst members of the upper middle class, if you will, a part of the nobility. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and end that lecture on this note. With that said, before I go ahead and wrap up, just like always, make sure that you're completing your assignments, reading articles from this week, going over the lecture video, and reading through chapter number 2 in the face of battle. If you do have any questions in the meantime, always feel free to reach out to me. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.